May 8th, 1945. Camp Hearne, Texas. The dust clung to everything. My throat, my hair, the fabric of my Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform that hadn't been washed in 3 weeks. I stood in a line with 42 other German women, swaying slightly from exhaustion, staring at the barbed wire fence that enclosed what would become our world. The Texas sun beat down with an aggression I'd never experienced in Bavaria. This heat was different, dry, relentless, suffocating. I am Analisa Krueger, 24 years old, former radio operator for the Africa Corps Communications Unit, and I was terrified. May 8th, 1945. First entry in captivity. We have arrived in America. I don't know if I will survive what comes next. If you think you know everything about La Boitouin, this story will shock you. Subscribe and drop a comment telling me what you think happened when they gave us that order. This gets incredibly unexpected. The journey to this moment had been a nightmare of its own. Captured in Tunisia in May 1943 after the Axis surrender, I'd spent 2 years in British POW camps in North Africa and England before being transferred across the Atlantic. The voyage took 17 days on a cramped Liberty ship, packed below deck with other female prisoners, most of us terrified of torpedo attacks from German U-boats, our own navy potentially killing us by mistake. But it was the propaganda that haunted us most during that voyage. For years, we'd been fed stories about American savagery. The Goebbels machine had painted vivid pictures. Americans were brutal, racist, vengeful. They would torture prisoners, rape women, humiliate us for sport. The Jews among the American forces, we were told, would exact terrible revenge for what had happened in Germany. Some of the women on that ship believed every word. Others, like me, didn't know what to believe anymore. The war had shattered certainty. But fear remained constant. When we finally docked at Norfolk, Virginia, the reality of America hit us like a physical force. The abundance, the infrastructure, the sheer scale of everything. British camps had been adequate but austere. America was something else entirely. Overwhelming, industrial, impossibly wealthy. We were loaded onto trains, passenger trains, not cattle cars, and transported across a country that seemed to have no end, through Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and finally into Texas. Mile after mile of land that hadn't been bombed, cities that still had lights, farms that still had workers. The contrast to Germany was devastating. Every woman in that train car understood the same truth, though none of us spoke it aloud. We had lost to a nation that hadn't even been touched by the war we'd brought to the world. Camp Hearne sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by flat Texas farmland that stretched to the horizon. It had been built quickly in 1942 to house Italian prisoners initially, then German POWs as the captures in North Africa increased. By the time we arrived in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. But we were still prisoners, still enemies, still subject to whatever our captors decided to do with us. The camp was enormous. Rows of tar paper barracks, guard towers, administrative buildings, all laid out with geometric precision. It could hold over 4,000 prisoners, though most were men housed in separate compounds. We 43 women were unusual cargo, female auxiliary personnel, nurses, and communication specialists who'd been captured in various theaters. As we stepped off the trucks that had brought us from the train station, American guards, MPs with white helmets and armbands, lined the path to the processing center. They didn't shout, didn't point rifles at us, just watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. That was the first surprise. The absence of hatred. Achtung, barked Oberfeldwebel Margareta Schultz, the senior NCO among us. We instinctively snapped to attention. Years of military discipline overriding exhaustion. The Americans didn't care about our formation or our ranks. They just wanted us to move forward in an orderly line. A female American officer, a captain with red hair and a clipboard, stood at the entrance to the processing building. She was flanked by 2 female soldiers, both armed, both watching us carefully. "Welcome to Camp Hearne," the captain said in accented but clear German. "I am Captain Sarah Henderson. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will receive adequate food, housing, and medical care. In exchange, you will follow all camp regulations. Any resistance will be met with disciplinary action. Any cooperation will be noted in your records. Do you understand? We nodded, uncertain what else to do. You will now proceed to the medical and sanitation facility for processing, Henderson continued. This is mandatory for all new arrivals. Follow the instructions of the staff. Any questions? Silence. We were too scared to ask questions. Good. Proceed inside. The processing facility was a long, rectangular building that smelled of disinfectant and soap. As we filed inside, I noticed the cleanliness. Floors that had been scrubbed recently, walls that were painted and maintained, windows that actually had intact glass. After years of war-damaged facilities and improvised camps, this felt almost clinical. We were divided into groups of 10 and led into separate rooms. My group included Erna Voigt, a former SS Helfer who'd worked in administrative functions, Liesel Bauer, a young nurse barely 20 years old, and 7 others whose names I was too exhausted and frightened to remember clearly in that moment. 2 American women in medical uniforms waited for us. One was older, maybe 45, with gray streaks in her dark hair. The other was younger, efficient-looking, with a clipboard and a neutral expression. "Remove all clothing," the older woman said in German. "Place your belongings in the bins provided. You will receive them back after inspection." The room fell silent. This was the moment we'd been dreading. The moment the propaganda had prepared us for. The humiliation. The abuse. The violation of dignity that would mark us as defeated, as conquered, as less than human. I felt my hands shaking as they moved toward the buttons of my jacket. Around me, the other women were frozen, some with tears already streaming down their faces. Liesel was whispering prayers. Erna's face had gone white, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. "I won't do it," Erna said suddenly, loudly in German. "I won't be humiliated like this." The older American woman, her name tag said Lieutenant Johnson, looked at Erna with an expression that wasn't anger, just tired patience. "This is not humiliation," Johnson said calmly in German. "This is sanitation protocol. You have been traveling for weeks in unsanitary conditions. You need to be examined for disease, deloused if necessary, bathed, and provided with clean clothing. This is standard procedure for all prisoners arriving at this facility, male or female, German, Italian, or Japanese. Everyone. You expect us to believe that?" Erna spat. "I expect you to follow the rules," Johnson replied. "You can comply willingly, or we can have guards assist you. Your choice. But this will happen. It's not negotiable." The threat of guards, male guards potentially, was enough. Slowly, reluctantly, we began to undress. I'd expected leering, expected comments, humiliation, mockery, expected the guards to be anything but professional. Instead, Johnson and her assistant moved through the room with clinical efficiency. They weren't looking at us as women, or as enemies, or as objects of revenge. They were processing prisoners according to a checklist, temperature taken, visual inspection for lice, wounds, or obvious disease, notes made on clipboards, everything documented, everything systematic. "You," Johnson pointed at me. "Any medical conditions? Injuries? Chronic illness?" "No," I whispered. "When was your last menstrual period?" The question was so unexpected, so practical, that I answered automatically. 2 weeks ago. Note that," Johnson told her assistant. "She'll need supplies next week." They were providing menstrual supplies. It was such a mundane detail, but it struck me with surprising force. They were thinking about our basic needs. After inspection, we were herded, naked, humiliated, but unharmed, into a large shower room. The showers were already running, steam filling the space. Not cold water for punishment. Hot water, actually hot. "Soap and shampoo on the shelves," Johnson called out. "You have 20 minutes. Use the time wisely." I stood under that hot water and nearly cried. It had been 3 weeks since a proper bath. 3 weeks of sweat, dust, fear, and filth. The water cascaded over me, washing away more than just physical dirt. The soap actually lathered. Real soap, not the waxy substitutes we'd had in Germany for years. The shampoo smelled like lemons. Around me, other women were having similar reactions. Some were crying openly. Others were just standing motionless, letting the water run over them, processing the reality that we weren't being tortured. We were being cleaned. After the showers, we were given towels, clean, white, soft towels, and led to another room where clothing had been laid out. Not our old uniforms, new clothes, or rather, used American clothing that had been cleaned and sorted. Simple dresses, undergarments, socks, shoes. Nothing fancy, everything practical. Dress quickly, Johnson instructed. Medical examination is next. The medical examination was thorough but professional. An American doctor, male, which caused new ripples of anxiety, examined each of us with a female nurse present at all times. He checked teeth, throats, listened to hearts and lungs, palpated for swollen lymph nodes or other abnormalities. Everything was documented. Everything was explained before it happened. You have a cavity, he told me matter-of-factly after looking in my mouth. Back molar, left side. We'll schedule dental work next week. Probably needs a filling. They were going to fix my teeth. German dentists had been impossible to access for the last year of the war, and here the Americans were casually scheduling dental appointments for prisoners. The final stop in processing was a large room with tables where we received our official prisoner documentation. Each woman was photographed, front and profile, holding a card with her prisoner number. Mine was W4827. The W was for weiblich, female. Then came fingerprinting, forms to fill out, in German, with American assistance, and assignment to quarters. Captain Henderson appeared again as we finished processing. You are now officially processed as prisoners of war under the jurisdiction of the United States Army, she announced. You will be housed in Compound F, which is designated for female prisoners. You will have access to medical care, adequate food, work assignments that provide compensation, male privileges under censorship, and recreational time. You are required to attend daily roll call, maintain your quarters to sanitation standards, and obey all camp regulations. Geneva Convention protections apply to you at all times. Any violations of your rights should be reported to the camp administration. Are there any questions? Erna raised her hand. What kind of work? Depends on your skills and camp needs. Laundry, kitchen work, agricultural labor, some administrative functions for qualified personnel. You will be paid in camp script that can be used at the canteen for personal items. Paid? Liesel asked, sounding as surprised as I felt. Geneva Convention requires compensation for prisoner labor. Henderson replied. 10 cents per day for general labor, up to 80 cents for skilled work. It's not much, but it allows you to purchase toiletries, writing paper, small comforts. This couldn't be real. This had to be some elaborate psychological torture, building us up before tearing us down. No one treated enemy prisoners this well. It was impossible, but it was happening. Compound F was a section of the camp separated from the main male prisoner areas by additional fencing. It consisted of 4 barracks buildings, a small administration office, a wash house, and a recreation area with a few benches and a volleyball net. We were divided into the barracks based on our processing groups. My barracks held 12 women, each of us assigned a bunk, double-tiered, metal frame but with actual mattresses, a foot locker, and a small shelf. The building had electric lights, a wood stove for heating, and windows with screens to keep out insects. After being shown our quarters, we were given an hour to settle in before dinner. I sat on my bunk, lower tier, third from the door, and tried to process what had just happened. We'd been captured. We'd been transported to America. We'd been processed like livestock through a systematic dehumanizing procedure, except it hadn't been dehumanizing. It had been the opposite. I don't understand, Liesel said quietly from the bunk next to mine. Where is the cruelty? Where is the revenge? Maybe it comes later, Erna said from across the room. She'd claimed an upper bunk in the corner, positioning herself with a clear view of both the door and the windows. Always tactical, always defensive. This is how they break you. They make you comfortable, make you compliant, then they strike. Or, I said slowly, they actually follow their own rules. Don't be naive, Krueger, Erna snapped. No one follows rules in war. The war is over, I reminded her. Germany surrendered 3 days before we arrived. Hitler is dead. The Reich is gone. There's nothing left to fight for. There's always something to fight for, Erna said, but her voice lacked conviction. The bell rang for dinner, a loud, clanging sound that would become familiar over the coming months. We filed out of the barracks and walked to the mess hall, a large building that served both as our dining facility and as an assembly space. The smell hit me first. Real food. Cooking meat, bread, vegetables. My stomach clenched with hunger I'd been suppressing for hours. We lined up cafeteria style, each receiving a tray, utensils, and portions served by American kitchen staff and some male German prisoners who'd been assigned to food service. The meal was simple but substantial. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and coffee. Real butter. Real coffee. I carried my tray to a long table where several women from my processing group had already sat. We ate in near silence, too focused on food to talk, too overwhelmed to process our situation verbally. The meatloaf was well cooked, seasoned adequately. The potatoes were smooth, the beans tender. The bread was white, soft, clearly fresh. The butter was real, not margarine. The coffee was weak by German standards, but hot and genuine. This was better than what German civilians had been eating for the last 2 years of the war, better than what German soldiers had been issued. We were prisoners, and we were being fed better than our own people. This is wrong, Erna muttered, pushing food around her plate, but eating nonetheless. They shouldn't feed us like this. Would you prefer we starve? Another woman asked. I'd prefer we weren't here at all. Erna shot back. But if we must be here, I'd prefer they treat us like enemies. This is confusing. She was right. It was confusing. The Americans had every reason to hate us, to punish us, to make us suffer as retribution for what Germany had done. Instead, they were feeding us, clothing us, housing us adequately, and processing us with bureaucratic efficiency. It was profoundly disorienting. That first night in the barracks, sleep was difficult for all of us. The anxiety, the exhaustion, the overwhelming strangeness of our situation kept minds racing even as bodies begged for rest. I lay in my bunk, staring at the wooden slats of the bunk above me, listening to the quiet sounds of women trying not to cry, trying not to think too hard about what came next. Someone was whispering prayers, probably Liesel. Someone else was snoring softly, exhaustion finally winning. Outside, the camp was quiet, except for the occasional footsteps of guards making their rounds. I pulled out the small notebook they'd returned to me after inspection. It had been in my belongings, and they'd examined it, but given it back along with a pencil. The pages were my diary, entries dating back to 1942 when I'd first joined the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Services. I turned to a blank page and began to write. May 8th, 1945. Evening of first day. We were not harmed. We were not abused. We were processed like inventory, but with care. They gave us hot water, soap, clean clothes, real food. I don't know what to make of this. Erna thinks it's psychological warfare. Liesel thinks it's American Christianity in action. I don't know what I think. I expected monsters and found bureaucrats. Is this mercy? Or is this just efficiency? Can a system be kind without being personal? I closed the notebook and tucked it under my mattress, wondering if they'd inspect our belongings regularly, if my writings would be confiscated or censored. But even that worry felt different here. In Germany, keeping a diary had been dangerous. The wrong words could mean investigation, punishment. Worse, here, they'd given the diary back. They'd provided the pencil. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it meant nothing. Time would tell. The second day began at 6 a.m. with a loud bell and shouted commands in both English and German. Roll call was mandatory. Held in the central yard of Compound F, we lined up in formation, old military habits dying hard, while American guards counted us and checked names against their lists. Captain Henderson addressed us again, this time outlining the daily schedule. 6:01 a.m. Wake up and roll call, 6:30 a.m. Breakfast, 7:30 a.m. Work assignments begin 12 p.m. Lunch, 1 p.m. Work resumes, 5 p.m. Work ends 5:30 p.m. Dinner, 6:30 p.m. Free time, 9 p.m. Lights out. Work assignments will be determined based on skills, physical capability, and camp needs, Henderson explained. You will be interviewed today to assess placement. Anyone with medical conditions or special circumstances should report to the camp hospital for evaluation. After breakfast, oatmeal, toast, fruit, milk, we were called individually to the administration office for work assignment interviews. When my turn came, I sat across a desk from an American corporal with a clipboard and a translator. Previous occupation? The corporal asked. Radio operator. Wehrmacht Auxiliary Signals Corps. He made notes. Any other skills? Typing. Some clerical work. Basic English. His eyebrows rose slightly. You speak English? A little. I studied it in school before the war. How well? I switched to English. Accent heavy but comprehensible. I can understand better than I speak. Reading is easier than conversation. More notes. We need English-speaking personnel for library services and as translators for education programs we're establishing. Interested? Yes, I said, surprised at how quickly I answered. You'll start in the camp library tomorrow. Report to Sergeant Miller at 7:30 a.m. You'll work 6 days a week, 8 hours daily. 40 cents per day in camp scrip. Questions? The library is for prisoners. Prisoners have right to educational and recreational materials under Geneva Convention. The library has books in German, English, some other languages. Prisoners can check out materials. You'll help manage the collection and assist with English classes if needed. I was going to work in a library. As a prisoner of war. In Texas. The absurdity was overwhelming. Over the next week, I began to understand the system that governed Camp Hearne. The Americans ran the camp with military precision. But the precision wasn't about cruelty. It was about efficiency. Everything was documented. Everything had procedures. Everything followed rules. Roll call happened twice daily. Always at the same times. Meals were served on schedule. Portions consistent. Work assignments were tracked. Hours logged. Compensation calculated. Medical care was available through sick call every morning. Mail privileges were granted weekly. Though all correspondence was censored, the male prisoners, thousands of them in the other compounds, had their own routines. We rarely saw them except at a distance, or during communal events like film screenings or concerts. The Americans kept genders separated strictly, partly for security, partly for propriety. But what struck me most was the absence of malice. The guards weren't friendly. They were professional. They didn't abuse prisoners, but they didn't befriend us either. They enforced rules, maintained order, and otherwise left us alone. When prisoners violated regulations, there were consequences. Loss of privileges, confinement to quarters, reduction in work compensation. But no beatings, no torture, no summary executions. It was a system designed to contain, not to punish, to maintain control, not to inflict suffering. And it worked. Within days, the routine became normal. Wake, roll call, breakfast, work, lunch, work, dinner, free time, sleep. Repeat. The predictability was almost comforting after years of war's chaos. The library assignment turned out to be genuine. Sergeant Miller was a bookish man from Massachusetts who took his job seriously. The camp library held over 2,000 volumes, mostly in German, acquired from various sources, including donations from American citizens of German descent, purchases from neutral countries, and confiscated materials from German merchant ships. Your job, Miller explained in slow, clear English on my first day, is to organize, catalog, and help prisoners find materials. We also run English classes 3 times a week. You'll assist as translator and tutor. Why do you teach us English? I asked. Geneva Convention encourages educational opportunities for prisoners. Also, practical. When the war ends, you'll go home. Germany will need to rebuild. English will be useful for international relations, trade, reconstruction. We're not just holding you here. We're preparing you for what comes after. The long-term thinking was staggering. They were already planning for German reconstruction, for a post-war world where former enemies would need skills to rebuild. The women in Compound F came from diverse backgrounds. Some, like me, had been auxiliary personnel, radio operators, clerks, drivers. Others had been nurses, captured while tending to wounded in field hospitals. A few had been civilian workers in occupied territories who'd been swept up in the final German retreats. Erna Voigt remained the most complicated figure among us. She'd been an SS Helferin, female auxiliary for the SS, working in administrative functions in occupied Poland. She didn't talk about what she'd seen or done, but the SS association made her both feared and isolated. She refused to acknowledge the war was truly over, refused to accept that Germany had lost completely. In our barracks, she'd organize the others militarily, maintain Nazi salutes when Americans weren't watching, and speak constantly about resistance, about honor, about loyalty to principles that no longer had a country to embody them. But even Erna couldn't resist the slow erosion of routine. By the second week, she'd accepted a work assignment: translator and teacher for German prisoners who wanted to learn English. The Americans had specifically requested someone with education and administrative experience. The pay was good, 80 cents per day, the highest rate available. "I'm not collaborating," Erna insisted one evening, as we sat outside the barracks during free time. "I'm using their system to maintain order among our people. It's strategic. You're teaching English to German prisoners so they can work with Americans after the war," I pointed out. "That sounds like collaboration to me." "It's survival," she snapped. "We do what we must to survive, then we rebuild. That's always been the plan." "Rebuild what? The Reich is gone, Erna. Hitler is dead. The camps are being liberated. Everything we fought for was a lie." "Not everything," she said quietly. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. May turned into June. The Texas heat intensified to levels that felt physically aggressive. We adapted, working in early mornings and late afternoons when possible, resting during the worst midday heat, drinking water constantly. The library became my refuge. Books provided escape, structure, purpose. I cataloged volumes, helped prisoners find materials, assisted with English classes, and slowly improved my own English through immersion and practice. The prisoners who came to the library were varied. Some wanted escape through fiction. Others wanted to learn, to improve themselves, to prepare for whatever came after imprisonment. A few just wanted quiet space away from the barracks. One regular visitor was a young German officer named Klaus Richter, a tank commander captured in France. He came every few days to check out English-language textbooks and American history books. "Why American history?" I asked him once. "Know your enemy," he said, then paused. "No. Former enemy. Know the people who defeated you. Understand how they think, what they value, why they fight. And what have you learned? That they're nothing like what we were told. They don't worship money and materialism. They worship systems and fairness. They believe rules should apply equally. They think efficiency is moral. It's strange, but effective." He wasn't wrong. The Americans at Camp Hearne embodied a peculiar combination of rigid system following and genuine belief that following those systems was ethically right. They treated prisoners well not because they liked us, but because the Geneva Convention said they should. They followed the rules because following rules was the correct thing to do. It was order without passion, structure without hatred, and it was defeating us more thoroughly than cruelty ever could. By mid-June, I'd been at Camp Hearne for 5 weeks. The routine had become so normal that I sometimes forgot I was a prisoner. The barracks felt like home. The work felt like purpose. The predictability felt like safety, but reality would intrude in unexpected ways. One afternoon, new prisoners arrived. A group of 30 German women captured during the final collapse of the Reich in Europe. They'd been in British camps first, then transferred across the Atlantic. We were assembled to meet them, to help them through processing, to answer questions, and ease their transition. I volunteered because I remembered my own terror on arrival, and I wanted to help. The new women looked worse than we had, more malnourished, more traumatized, more broken. They'd lived through the final apocalyptic weeks of the war in Germany, seen the total devastation, experienced the absolute collapse of everything they'd known. As they went through processing, the same routine I'd experienced, I watched their faces transform from terror to confusion to cautious relief. The same journey, the same realization. One young woman, maybe 19, grabbed my arm as she emerged from the showers. "They didn't hurt us," she whispered, tears streaming. "I was so scared. And they didn't hurt us." "No," I confirmed. "They won't. They follow their rules. It's what they do. But we're German. We're the enemy. After everything we did. They follow their rules, I repeated. That's how they won. Not by becoming like us. She sobbed and I held her, understanding exactly what she was feeling. The relief, the guilt, the confusion of being treated humanely by people you'd been taught to fear and hate. Later that evening, I wrote in my diary, June 15th, 1945. New prisoners arrived today. I saw myself in them. The fear, the surprise, the cognitive dissonance of humane treatment. How do we reconcile what we were told about Americans with what we've experienced? How do we process being defeated by decency rather than brutality? Erna says it's manipulation. Liesel says it's grace. I think it's something else. It's the victory of systems over chaos, of principles over passion. They beat us with organization, with discipline, with the quiet power of actually following the rules they claim to believe in. That might be the most devastating defeat of all. I closed the notebook and looked around the barracks. Women sleeping peacefully. No fear of midnight raids. No sounds of violence. No hunger gnawing at our bellies. We were prisoners. We were defeated. We were confined. But we were alive, fed, clean, and safe. The Americans had defeated us without hating us. And somehow, that made everything we'd fought for feel even more meaningless than if they'd simply destroyed us with rage. July 4th, 1945, Camp Hearne, Texas. Independence Day in America meant something I was only beginning to understand. The camp celebrated with special meals, reduced work hours, and an evening of music and films. We prisoners were included, not as participants exactly, but as witnesses to American patriotism on display. I sat on a bench in the recreation area, watching American soldiers raise the flag while a band played the national anthem. Around me, German prisoners stood awkwardly, unsure of proper protocol. Some stood at attention from habit, others slouched in deliberate defiance. Most, like me, just watched with complicated feelings that had no simple expression. 2 months since arrival. 2 months of routine, of work, of slowly accepting that we weren't going to be tortured or killed. 2 months of having our expectations systematically dismantled by the relentless normalcy of American prison administration. July 4th, 1945. Personal observation. They celebrate freedom while holding us captive. The irony seems lost on them. Or perhaps they understand freedom differently than we do. Not as the absence of constraint, but as the presence of fair rules applied equally. Even to enemies. The work in the library had become genuinely engaging. I'd progressed from simple cataloging to teaching basic English classes twice a week. My own English had improved dramatically through immersion and necessity. I could now read American newspapers, censored but available, and follow conversations with minimal translation. Sergeant Miller had proven to be a patient supervisor, and surprisingly, something approaching a mentor. He'd been a librarian in civilian life, drafted into service, and assigned to POW camp administration based on his skills. "You're good at this," he told me one afternoon as I organized new arrivals, donated books from a church group in Houston. "Have you considered library science as a profession after the war?" The question caught me off guard. After the war still felt abstract, impossible. What would happen to us? When would we be repatriated? Would there even be a Germany to return to? "I was a radio operator," I said. "That's all I know." "You were a radio operator," Miller corrected. "Now you're demonstrating aptitude for education and information management. People change. Skills transfer. The person you were before the war doesn't have to be the person you become after." It was a radical thought. That this experience, imprisonment, forced adaptation, learning new skills, could actually be transformative rather than merely traumatic. "What will happen to us?" I asked. "When will we go home?" Miller's expression grew serious. "Honestly, I don't know. Official policy is repatriation after hostilities conclude and arrangements can be made. But Germany is complicated right now. Divided into occupation zones, cities destroyed, infrastructure collapsed. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners while simultaneously managing humanitarian crisis in Germany itself. It's going to take time." So we stay here indefinitely? For now, yes, but that's not necessarily bad. Here, you have food, shelter, safety. Germany right now has none of those reliably. You might be better off staying longer than you think. The idea that imprisonment in America might be preferable to freedom in devastated Germany was darkly ironic, but he wasn't wrong. The education programs at Camp Hearne had expanded significantly by July. Beyond basic English classes, there were now courses in mathematics, American civics, vocational skills, and even democratic theory, part of a broader denazification effort. The Americans were attempting to re-educate German prisoners, to expose us to democratic principles, to prepare us for participating in whatever political system would emerge in post-war Germany. Some prisoners embraced these programs enthusiastically. Others, particularly former Nazi Party members, resisted or attended only under compulsion. Erna fell somewhere in the middle. She attended because attendance affected her work assignment and compensation, but she sat in back, arms crossed, expression skeptical. I found myself genuinely interested, particularly in the civics courses taught by an American lieutenant named Thomas Brennan. He'd been a high school teacher before the war, and his approach was more Socratic than propagandistic. "What is democracy?" he asked our class one evening, speaking in German with occasional English terms, hands raised tentatively. We'd been taught that democracy was weak, chaotic, controlled by Jewish banking interests, the standard Nazi propaganda. "Government by the people," one prisoner offered uncertainly. "More specific," Brennan encouraged. "What does by the people actually mean in practice?" "Elections," I said. "Citizens vote for representatives who govern according to laws that apply equally to all." "Good. And what protects this system? What prevents the majority from oppressing minorities? What stops leaders from becoming dictators?" The question hung in air, thick with historical irony. We all knew the answer from our own recent experience. Nothing had stopped it in Germany. "Constitutional limits," another prisoner said quietly. "Separation of powers. Rule of law." "Exactly," Brennan said. "Democracy isn't just voting. It's a system of constraints, checks and balances, rights that cannot be voted away, institutions that limit power. It's messy and slow and frustrating. But those limitations are features, not bugs. They prevent tyranny." After class, Erna cornered me outside. "You actually believe this propaganda?" "It's not propaganda if it's demonstrably true," I replied. "Look around you, Erna. We're enemy prisoners being fed, housed, educated, and paid for our work according to established rules. When's the last time Germany treated enemy prisoners, or even its own citizens, with that level of systematic fairness?" "We treated our people well," she protested. "Did we? Or did we treat people the regime deemed acceptable well, while systematically destroying everyone else? Because from here, those look very different." Erna's face darkened. "Be careful, Analisa. That kind of thinking is how they win. They make you doubt everything. Make you ashamed of who you are. Make you complicit in your own defeat." "Maybe I should doubt everything," I said quietly. "Maybe we all should have doubted more before the war. Maybe that's the lesson. Question authority, demand accountability, refuse to follow orders that violate basic humanity." "You sound like them now," Erna said, and walked away. But her accusation didn't sting the way she'd intended, because maybe sounding like them, like people who valued systems over strong men, rules over rage, procedural fairness over passionate revenge, wasn't the betrayal she thought it was. Maybe it was exactly what we should have sounded like all along. August brought oppressive heat and news from Europe that arrived in fragments through censored newspapers, and occasional announcements from camp administration. The full extent of Nazi atrocities was being revealed. Concentration camps liberated, mass graves discovered, survivors with tattooed numbers and skeletal bodies appearing in newsreels. The numbers were incomprehensible. Millions murdered in systematic industrial genocide. We'd heard rumors during the war. Whispers, things people knew but didn't speak about openly. I dismissed much of it as exaggeration, as wartime propaganda, as impossible. It wasn't impossible. It had happened. We'd done it. The revelation fractured the prisoner community. Some refused to believe it, claiming Allied fabrication. Others retreated into guilt-stricken silence. A few became vocally remorseful, seeking absolution through confession and cooperation. Erna surprisingly became quieter. She stopped organizing informal military formations in the barracks, stopped insisting on Nazi salutes, stopped speaking about resistance and honor. One night, I found her sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at nothing. "You knew," I said. "Not a question." "Not details," she replied after long silence. "But yes, we knew something was happening. Trains going east filled with people, trains coming back empty. The euphemisms, resettlement, special treatment, final solution. We knew they meant something terrible. We just didn't ask, didn't look, didn't think about what our silence made us complicit in. What do we do with that?" I asked. "How do we live with knowing?" "I don't know," Erna admitted. "The Americans keep saying we need to acknowledge it, to take responsibility, to commit to being different. But how do you take responsibility for something so massive? How do you change enough to deserve a future after participating in that past?" I had no answer. None of us did, but the question itself felt like progress. September brought a shift in camp atmosphere as the reality of long-term imprisonment settled in. We wouldn't be going home soon. Germany was occupied, divided, still being sorted out by the victorious powers. Repatriation would happen eventually, but nobody could say when. The Americans responded by expanding education and vocational programs further. More classes, more skills training, more preparation for eventual return to a Germany that would need rebuilding from rubble. I was promoted, if that's the right word for a prisoner, to senior library assistant with supervisory responsibilities for the expanded English language program. My pay increased to 60 cents per day, which I used to buy writing paper, soap, and occasionally chocolate from the camp canteen. The canteen itself was a marvel, a small shop where prisoners could purchase personal items using camp scrip earned through work. Toiletries, snacks, writing materials, even some clothing items. The existence of prisoner commerce, of economic activity within captivity, seemed contradictory, but was perfectly aligned with American thinking. Follow the rules, work hard, earn compensation, exercise limited choice within controlled parameters. It was freedom's shadow, enough autonomy to feel human without enough to be dangerous. One afternoon, a new shipment of books arrived from a donation drive in Austin. Among them was a collection of American poetry: Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, Langston Hughes. I'd never read American poetry before. Whitman's Leaves of Grass particularly struck me. His celebration of democracy, of individual dignity, of multitudes and contradictions. His insistence that America was an idea as much as a place. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. The radical equality in those lines, the assumption that every person possessed inherent worth, that dignity belonged to everyone not through achievement but through existence, felt revolutionary coming from the culture I'd been taught was materialistic and soulless. I assigned Whitman to my English classes, watching German prisoners wrestle with American poetry, trying to translate not just words but concepts, became one of the most interesting aspects of my work. "Why do they write like this?" one student asked, frustrated by Whitman's unconventional style. "It doesn't follow proper form." "Maybe that's the point," I suggested. Democratic poetry for a democratic culture. Breaking forms that constrain. Celebrating the individual voice even when it doesn't conform to tradition. Teaching American literature to German prisoners of war in Texas. The absurdity and significance weren't lost on me. October 1945. I'd been at Camp Hearne for 5 months. The routine had become so deeply normal that my previous life, the war, Germany, my family, felt increasingly distant, almost dreamlike. Letters from home arrived occasionally, heavily censored, often months old. My mother wrote that she was alive, living in what was now the Soviet occupation zone, struggling with food shortages, but surviving. My younger brother had died in the final weeks of the war, killed during the Battle of Berlin. She'd only learned of it weeks after the fact. I cried for hours after reading that letter. My brother, Carl, had been 17, conscripted in the desperate final months when Germany was throwing children into combat. He'd died for a regime that was already defeated, in a cause that had been lost, for leaders who'd fled or committed suicide rather than face consequences for their decisions. Liesel found me that evening, still crying, and sat with me in silence. She'd lost her entire family, parents and 2 sisters, in the firebombing of Dresden. Her grief was older, more processed, but still present. "How do you keep going?" I asked her. "I don't know," she admitted. "Some days I don't think I am. I'm just moving through motions, following routine, existing without really living. But maybe that's enough for now. Maybe we're not supposed to be okay yet. Maybe just surviving is the victory." The next day, I requested permission to visit the camp chaplain, an American Protestant minister who provided religious services and counseling for prisoners who wanted it. Father Murphy was Irish-American, round-faced, with kind eyes, and a Boston accent I was still learning to understand. He listened to my grief about Carl, about guilt for being safe while my family suffered, about confusion over being treated well by people I'd been taught to hate. "You're experiencing cognitive dissonance," he said. "Your beliefs about Americans clash with your actual experience of Americans. That creates psychological tension. How do I resolve it? By acknowledging that the world is more complex than propaganda suggests, that people are individuals, not monolithic groups, that systems matter more than stereotypes, and that hatred is a choice, not an inevitability." "The Germans chose hatred," I said bitterly. "We chose to believe we were superior, that others were subhuman, that violence was justified. We chose all of it. Some Germans chose that," Murphy corrected. "Others were coerced, or complicit through silence, or simply tried to survive in an impossible system. But yes, as a nation, Germany made terrible choices. The question now is, what will you choose going forward? Will you carry hatred into whatever comes next? Or will you choose differently?" It was the same question Erna had been wrestling with, the same question all of us faced. What would we become after this? November brought cooler weather and another wave of revelations as the Nuremberg trials began. 24 top Nazi leaders indicted for war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. Camp Hearne received regular updates, posted announcements, newspaper articles, occasionally film footage when educational screenings were organized. The Americans wanted us to understand what had been done in our name. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents, photographs, testimony from survivors and perpetrators alike. The systematic nature of the genocide, the bureaucratic efficiency of murder, the casual cruelty of those who'd implemented it. Some prisoners couldn't watch. Others forced themselves to, understanding that witnessing was a form of responsibility. I fell into the second category. If I'd been part of the system, even in minor ways, even just by maintaining communications equipment, then I owed it to the victims to know, to see, to acknowledge. After one particularly difficult screening, Lieutenant Brennan organized a discussion session. Optional attendance, no repercussions for not participating. About 40 prisoners showed up, including me and Erna. And "How do we move forward from this?" Brennan asked, not rhetorically but genuinely seeking our thoughts. As individuals and as a nation, how does Germany process this and rebuild? The silence was heavy with things we didn't know how to articulate. Finally, an older prisoner, a former teacher named Hoffman, spoke. "We tell the truth, to ourselves, to our children, to the world. We don't hide from it. We don't make excuses. We acknowledge what was done. We identify how it happened, and we commit to never allowing it again. And we hold people accountable." Another prisoner added, "Those responsible must face justice. We can't move forward without consequences." "What about those of us who weren't directly responsible but were part of the system?" Erna asked quietly. "What about those who knew, or suspected, or just went along because it was easier than resisting? What do we owe?" Brennan considered the question carefully. That's something each person has to answer for themselves. But I'd suggest that acknowledgement is a start. Understanding how you contributed, even passively. Committing to active resistance to such systems in the future. And perhaps most importantly, building something better. Can we? I asked. Can people who were part of this actually be trusted to build something better? I don't know, Brennan admitted. But the alternative is to write off an entire generation, an entire nation, as irredeemable. That path leads nowhere good. So we have to try. We have to believe that people can learn, can change, can choose differently even after choosing terribly. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? That night, I wrote extensively in my diary. November 14th, 1945. After today's screening and discussion, I understand something crucial. The Americans aren't treating us well despite what Germany did. They're treating us well because of what Germany did. They're proving, systematically and deliberately, that civilization doesn't require brutality, that victory doesn't require vengeance, that you can defeat evil without becoming evil. They're teaching us through example what we failed to learn through propaganda, that strength and decency aren't opposites, that the rule of law can coexist with human dignity, that systems built on fairness actually work better than systems built on fear. This is their victory. Not just military, but moral. They beat us with organization, yes, but more than that, they beat us by being demonstrably better than what we'd become. And that's the defeat that actually matters. December 1945. Christmas approached. My first Christmas as a prisoner. My second Christmas separated from family. The Americans organized celebrations that tried to balance their own traditions with respect for prisoner culture. A Christmas tree appeared in the camp center. Massive, decorated, absurd in the Texas landscape. German prisoners were allowed to hold religious services, sing traditional carols, even prepare some traditional foods in the kitchens. I volunteered to help organize the library's contribution, a collection of Christmas stories and poems available for checkout, plus a reading event where prisoners could share favorite seasonal memories. The reading event became unexpectedly emotional. One by one, German prisoners shared stories of Christmases past, family traditions, cherished memories, moments of peace before the war destroyed everything. Grown men and women cried openly, mourning not just absent family but a lost world, an innocence that couldn't be recovered. Erna surprisingly volunteered to read. She chose a traditional German Christmas poem, Vom Himmel hoch, da komm ich her, and recited it from memory in a voice that shook with suppressed emotion. Afterwards, I found her alone outside, smoking a cigarette someone had traded her. I didn't know you smoked, I said. Started recently, she admitted. Helps with the thinking. What are you thinking about? About how much I miss home. About how home doesn't exist anymore. Not the physical place. Not the Germany I knew. About how we have to build something new from rubble and guilt, and whatever fragments of decency we can salvage. That's a lot of thinking, I observed. The Americans want us to think, Erna said. That's their strategy. They give us time, safety, education, exposure to their way of thinking. They're betting that given enough space to actually reflect, enough absence of immediate threat, we'll come to conclusions they can't force on us. And damn it, it's working. Is that so terrible? It's terrifying, Erna said honestly, because it means everything I believed, everything I fought for, everything I was willing to die for. It was based on lies, and I let myself believe those lies because questioning them was harder than accepting them. That's not something you get over easily. No, I agreed. But maybe getting over it isn't the goal. Maybe carrying that knowledge, letting it change you, using it to do better. Maybe that's enough. Erna laughed bitterly. You sound like one of Brennan's civics lectures. Maybe Brennan has a point. We stood in comfortable silence. 2 German women in Texas, prisoners and students, and something neither of us had words for yet. January 1946. 7 months since arrival. The routine had become so normal, it required conscious effort to remember I was technically imprisoned. Work in the library, English classes, reading American literature, writing in my diary, eating regular meals, sleeping in a warm barracks. The rhythm of captivity had become the rhythm of life. Repatriation was beginning, slowly, in small groups, for prisoners with verified destinations and circumstances. But most of us were in limbo. Germany was still chaos. The occupation zones were still being sorted. Infrastructure was still devastated. Returning to that wasn't necessarily desirable. Some prisoners actually requested to stay longer, to continue education programs, to keep earning compensation through work, to remain in the structured safety of American administration rather than face the uncertainty of ruined Germany. The irony was profound. prisoners choosing captivity over freedom, because captivity offered more stability. I was offered early repatriation in February. My mother had submitted documentation requesting my return to help with family survival. I declined. Why? Captain Henderson asked when I informed her. Don't you want to go home? Home is destroyed, I said. My brother is dead. My mother is in the Soviet zone, surviving on near-starvation rations. What can I do there except add one more mouth to feed? Here, I have purpose. I'm learning skills. I'm earning compensation I can eventually send to help her. I'm more useful here than there. Henderson studied me carefully. You understand that prisoners requesting to stay may face additional scrutiny regarding their motivations and politics? I understand. I'm not staying because I'm a secret Nazi hoping to avoid denazification. I'm staying because I genuinely believe I'll be more prepared to help rebuild Germany if I complete the education programs available here. That's what I thought, Henderson said. Permission granted. You can stay until your assigned repatriation date, which won't be for several more months at least. Spring 1946 brought new growth, literal and metaphorical. The Texas landscape transformed from brown to green. The camp expanded education programs further. The library received a large donation of books about post-war reconstruction, economics, democratic government theory. I was assigned to lead an advanced English discussion group focused on these materials. We read about the Marshall Plan being discussed for European recovery, about democratic constitution design, about economic theories for rebuilding devastated nations. They're training us to go home and rebuild Germany as a democracy, one prisoner observed during discussion. That's what all this is for. Is that so terrible? Another asked. It's colonization by education, the first replied. They're making us into Americans in our thinking. Or, I interjected, they're exposing us to principles that work. Rule of law, democratic accountability, economic cooperation, and trusting us to adapt those principles to German culture. There's a difference between colonization and education. You've really drunk the Kool-Aid, the first prisoner muttered, using American slang we'd learned. Maybe I had. But what was the alternative? Return to the thinking that had led Germany into catastrophic war and genocide? Cling to nationalism and authoritarianism, because questioning them meant acknowledging we'd been wrong? No. If accepting American perspectives on democracy and human rights meant drinking the Kool-Aid, then I'd drink deeply and gratefully. June 1946, 1 year since arrival. The anniversary passed with little fanfare, but significant personal reflection. I'd spent a full year as a prisoner of war in Texas, a year of unexpected education, of psychological transformation, of beliefs challenged and reformed. I'd arrived terrified, expecting abuse, prepared to resist with whatever dignity I could maintain. Instead, I'd found a system that was bureaucratic and imperfect, but fundamentally decent, that followed rules it had established, that treated prisoners as human beings with rights rather than enemies to be destroyed. And that systematic decency had defeated me more thoroughly than cruelty ever could. Erna approached me one afternoon in the library. She'd become a full-time educator in the camp, teaching both English and basic democratic civics to incoming prisoners. The transformation from SS Helferin to democracy teacher was remarkable, though she'd insist it was just pragmatic adaptation. I'm being repatriated next month, she told me. British zone, where I have family. Congratulations, I said, meaning it. I wanted to thank you, Erna continued, which surprised me, for the conversations, for challenging me, for not letting me hide in denial and defiance. You did the work yourself, I replied. I just asked questions. Questions matter, Erna said. That's something I've learned here. The Americans don't just tell us what to think. They ask us questions and make us figure out the answers ourselves. It's frustrating as hell, but it's effective. You can't force someone to change their mind. You can only create conditions where they might choose to change it themselves. What will you do? When you go back, teach, Erna said simply. Use the English I've learned, the education methods I've been trained in, the democratic principles I've been exposed to, and teach. Help rebuild German education from people who understand what the old system created and are committed to doing better. That's good work, I said. It's necessary work, Erna corrected. It's the least I can do to try to compensate for what I was complicit in before. After she left, I sat in the quiet library and thought about compensation, about redemption, about whether people who'd been part of terrible systems could be trusted to build better ones. I decided the answer had to be yes, not because everyone deserved redemption, but because writing off entire generations as irredeemable ensured cycles of violence continued. Someone had to break the cycle. It might as well be us. August 1946. My repatriation was finally scheduled for September. I'd spend 14 months at Camp Hearne, longer than many prisoners by my own choice, to complete as much education and training as possible. Sergeant Miller organized a small farewell gathering at the library. Nothing elaborate, just coffee and cookies, a few people who'd worked with me over the months. "You've been one of the best assistants I've had," Miller told me. "Have you given more thought to library science as a career?" "I have," I admitted. "When I return to Germany, if there are opportunities, I'd like to work in education or libraries. Help rebuild cultural institutions. Make information accessible to people learning to think critically again." "You'll be good at it," Miller said. "And if you ever need a reference or recommendation, write to me. I'll vouch for your skills and character." It was a small thing, an American soldier offering to provide professional references for a German former prisoner, but it symbolized something larger. The possibility of moving beyond war, beyond enmity, into professional cooperation and mutual respect. The night before my departure, I sat in the barracks one last time, writing a final entry in my diary. August 28, 1946. Tomorrow I leave Camp Hearne and begin the journey back to Germany. 14 months ago, I arrived here terrified, expecting abuse and humiliation. Instead, I found a system that defeated me with decency, that taught me through example rather than force, that showed me what civilization actually means, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of fair rules applied consistently. I'm returning to a Germany that's destroyed physically and morally. That needs to rebuild not just buildings, but the entire foundation of how we govern ourselves, how we treat each other, how we participate in the world. It's overwhelming, but I'm also returning with skills, knowledge, and a crucial understanding. The Americans didn't defeat us through hatred. They defeated us through organization, through systematic fairness, through the radical act of treating enemies as human beings with rights. They proved that you don't have to become monsters to defeat monsters. That civilization survives not through vengeance, but through principle. That's the lesson I carry home. That's what I'll try to build on. They didn't hate us. That's how they won. September 1st, 1946, the last day at Camp Hearne. We gathered, 15 women being repatriated in this group, for final processing, paperwork, verification of destination, medical clearance, return of personal items that had been held, and a small amount of money to assist with immediate needs upon arrival. Captain Henderson, who'd overseen our time here from the beginning, addressed us one final time. "You're returning to a Germany that needs rebuilding in every sense," she said. "What you do with that opportunity is up to you. But remember what you've learned here. That systems matter, that rules applied fairly create better outcomes than arbitrary power, that human rights aren't negotiable, and that yesterday's enemies can become tomorrow's colleagues if we choose cooperation over revenge." We boarded trucks that took us to the train station, then trains across Texas, through the South, to New York, then a ship across the Atlantic, much nicer than the voyage west had been, now that we were technically free rather than prisoners. The journey took 3 weeks, September 24th, 1946. Bremerhaven, Germany. The ship docked in what had been a major German port. Now it was rubble and reconstruction. British occupation forces everywhere. German civilians looking gaunt and desperate. I stepped onto German soil for the first time in over 3 years. The reality of destruction hit immediately. Not propaganda, not exaggeration, but genuine devastation. Buildings collapsed. Infrastructure destroyed. People hollow-eyed from hunger and trauma. This was what we'd brought on ourselves. I made my way through British processing, received temporary documentation, and began the long journey to the Soviet zone where my mother waited. The Germany I'd left in 1943 was gone. The Germany I returned to in 1946 was a different country entirely. Defeated, occupied, destroyed, and facing the monumental task of rebuilding not just physically, but morally. But I wasn't the same person either. I'd left as a true believer in the Reich. I'd returned as someone who understood that the true victory wasn't military. It was moral. The Americans had shown me, through 14 months of systematic decency, that civilization meant something more than I'd been taught. It meant rules that applied to everyone, dignity that belonged to everyone, rights that couldn't be voted away, systems that valued fairness over power. Those principles had defeated Germany more thoroughly than bombs ever could. And now, those were the principles I'd work to build in whatever emerged from the rubble. Epilogue. West Berlin. I'm 31 years old, the assistant director of a public library in the American sector of Berlin. I teach evening classes in English and democratic civics. I translate American books into German for publication. I work with the American occupation authorities on education reform programs. My mother survived, remarried, lives modestly but adequately in what's now the German Democratic Republic. We write regularly, though our letters are censored by both sides of the increasingly solid divide between East and West. Erna kept her word. She teaches in Hamburg, working with children, trying to build a generation that will question authority and resist authoritarianism. We correspond occasionally, comparing notes on the impossible task of teaching democracy to people recovering from dictatorship. Germany is rebuilding. Not quickly, not easily, but genuinely. The Marshall Plan is pumping resources into reconstruction. Democratic institutions are being established. Elections happen. Courts enforce laws. The Constitution includes protections designed to prevent another Hitler. It's messy. It's imperfect. It's frustrating. But it's working. Last week, an American soldier came into the library looking for books about German history. He was young, maybe 22, stationed in Berlin as part of the occupation forces. "Can you recommend something?" he asked in broken German. I responded in English. "Are you interested in contemporary history or older periods?" His eyes widened. "Your English is really good. I had an excellent teacher," I said, thinking of Sergeant Miller and Lieutenant Brennan and all those discussions in classes. "I learned it at Camp Hearne in Texas." "You were a prisoner there?" "For 14 months. Best education I ever received." He looked confused, trying to process how a former enemy prisoner could speak positively about imprisonment. "It changed my life," I explained. "Taught me that the true victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's treating them well enough that they stop being enemies. That's what America did. That's what we're trying to build here now." The young soldier left with books about Weimar Republic history and Nazi rise to power, cautionary tales we study now to avoid repeating. After he left, I sat at my desk and thought about that moment in May 1945 when I'd arrived at Camp Hearne, terrified they'd tell us to take off our clothes. Certain humiliation and abuse awaited. Instead, I'd found hot water, soap, clean towels, and the beginning of transformation. They'd defeated us without hating us. That lesson, that radical revolutionary lesson, had become the foundation of everything I'd built since. In my desk drawer, I keep my old diary from Camp Hearne. Sometimes I read through it, remembering the fear, the confusion, the gradual realization that decency could be systematic, that fairness could be powerful, that civilization meant something more than we'd been taught. The last entry remains my favorite. They didn't hate us. That's how they won. It's the truth I try to live by now. In my work, in my teaching, in my small contributions to rebuilding Germany. We were defeated by a nation that chose to remain civilized, even in victory. That might be the most important lesson of the entire war. If this story changed how you think about Hohen, about enemies and humanity, about how we treat those we defeat, please subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What would you have done in Annalisa's position? How do we balance justice and mercy, accountability and redemption, punishment and rehabilitation? These questions matter today as much as they did in 1945. Real change happens when we choose to be better than our worst impulses, when we build systems based on fairness instead of revenge. That's the lesson of Camp Hearne. That's the lesson we still need to learn. Thanks for listening to this untold story from What. See you in the next one.